Hey guys, this is Not Lammers of Invoked 101, and today I wanted to kind of do a follow-up video to my old, I think it was like competitive players versus casual players versus what a bad player is. This is going to be along the lines of cards and cards and ideas that you see when people put together competitive decks, casual decks, and bad decks. So why we talked about the players before, now we're talking about what decks they'll play. So I actually have a selection of cards set out next to me to point out a few things. So we can go with competitive players first. So a competitive player, when they build their decks, a lot of the time they'll look at what everyone else is playing, what to play, and see what's winning. So currently you'll see someone who goes, oh, well, Sky Strikers are winning. Those are doing really well. I should play that. And usually they'll throw in a couple tech cards, something like Metal Foes Fusion, which lets you draw an extra card, and Foolish Burial Goods, which lets you send your spell cards to the graveyard. So stuff like that. They'll usually play like 3 Foolish Goods to also help their Sky Striker engine and get them get the Metal Foes Fusion into the graveyard, along with 3 Ray. And usually they're playing the 3 ofs with the 2 ofs, and usually a lot of competitive players will look at pros and cons of cards. Something like a very controversial card here. I actually have it set out next to me. Something like Pot of Desires. People will casuals and competitive players have been debating about this all the time. Competitive players usually say it's pretty good, casuals say it's pretty bad. So usually you won't see Pot of Desires in most casual decks. You'll more likely to see it in competitive decks as a 2 of or a 3 of. But yeah, most competitive decks will be like 3 of like the main card, or 3 of like a really good card, and then 3 of like the best supports, and they'll play a lot of 3 ofs along with a few garnets, which are like either cards that you need to search or cards that you don't want to draw because you want to grab them off of something else. The same logic behind why players play 3 Terratop and 1 Tactomberg, and why players still use 3 Brilliant Fusion and 1 Garnet and the Trick Clown. So it's along those lines, for examples. So a lot of competitive players will take the sacrifice. Even I take that risk playing the 1 Yellow Star and the 1 Red Moon with my Mech Knight Invoked. So, but yeah, and another thing about competitive players is usually they're, like, a lot of people will, or like more casual and bad players will say, well, competitive players are all the same. A lot of their decks are the same. If you actually look at a lot of the competitive strategies nowadays, a lot of them do feature their own different techs and strategies built into it. So like I remember playing doing mirror matches at the Tulsa Regional. I had a mirror match against the Mech Knight Invoke player, and his deck, while it was similar, it also had a lot of different cards in it, specifically in his extra, so he had different things to go into that. He also was playing Mind Control, which I wasn't. Again, at the Tulsa Regional, I was playing against 60 card decks. I played against 6 of them, and not once did I ever see I doubt they were all exactly the same with those 60 card variants. I bet they were all playing grass and all playing Left Arm Offering along with some sort of zombie engine. But no, I saw Lightsorn Zombie and Dino Zombie, and I think even one of them was playing Shadalls. So to say that all these competitive decks are the same and to lump them all into that one category is kind of not correct. Because you will always find differences, whether how small they are, between competitive players' decks. And it's those differences that make the decks play a lot differently. While they can produce similar boards, and they produce probably the same amount of boards and get about the same amount of wins, the decks are completely different to that player, to that competitive player. And even when I was playing ABC competitively and I ran into another ABC player, I asked him about his card choice and why he was playing those, such as like Destrudo ABC versus regular ABC. That was a big debate for a while in the competitive community, which one was better. But yeah, so let's move into a casual player standpoint. So a casual player, I have some cards down here. A casual player might play some subpar cards, which isn't a fact on them, because that's not like a knock at them, but it is more. A casual player might play some more subpar cards, because I know that a lot of people who don't see them I know a lot of people who say it's like, oh well, I don't play a meta deck, so I'm a casual. So that's what I mean here. But just because you don't play a meta deck doesn't make you not competitive. That's the way. This is just going to be talking like overall that, and focusing more on like the budget and more casual decks that aren't competitive, the non-competitive stuff. So this is like where you'll find tier 2 decks and stuff like that. Casual players definitely build their decks with a more fun mindset. They see the game as, they're not trying, of course casuals do try to win. It's definitely like, I think anyone who plays the game tries to win, except for when we get to how bad players build the deck. But usually whenever I see like a casual deck, or like something that I see as a casual deck list, there's only a few cards in there that I see, and usually it's because it's the reasoning they don't have like a play set of a certain card is, well, it's like $50 and I don't play all that often, or I don't play this deck too often, so I'm not going to splurge on it. And I get that completely. Like whenever I built Ancient Gears, I wasn't going to spend $20 on an Ancient Gear Fusion when I already had one, and you can run it really with one. So I feel that completely on their end. But yeah, there's definitely a thing. One of the big differences I notice is that when competitive players build a deck, they definitely set out slots for cards like Ghost Ogre and Snow Rabbit and Ash Blossom and Joyous Spring. They definitely set out space in their deck for that. A lot of casual players don't set out space for hand traps, and they just play without hand traps. And that's a big difference between competitive players and casual players, is the hand traps. You usually don't see Ghost Ogre and Snow Rabbit in there. You almost never see Ash in casual decks. You might see Effect Veiler. I've seen some casual players playing Effect Veiler, which is a good card. But for the most part, they don't really set out space for hand traps. Even players who play Blue Eyes, which actually loves having the hand traps in it, they don't play. So it's really a big difference between that. So, but I'm not saying that if you're a casual player that you can't play hand traps. No, I'm saying, but every time I've ran into a casual player, and they're like, oh, and like I drop a hand trap on them, they're like, oh, you're playing the hand trap. So it's like, well, sorry, I want to win. So that's another big difference, is that casuals usually don't put in the space for hand traps that competitive players think ahead for. They definitely build their decks with the hand traps in mind. I also think that casual players play a little bit more obscure cards. I think that because of it, their decks do tend to slightly be a bit more creative. Like something recently that came out was Light a Secca. So if you're a casual player, that's a really good draw card. So I remember a lot of people who I've had chats with in big group chats. They mentioned that, oh, Super Heavy Samurai, and that would be interesting. And so there was some Super Heavy Samurai fans that were excited for the Light a Secca card. I was excited for it for Skull Servants, because Skull Servants is a really fun deck. But yeah, so a card like that you'll see. So a card like Light a Secca you might not see in a competitive deck. You'll see Pot of Desires, but for a casual player, maybe they don't mind not playing all the whatevers and want to pull off some really janky monster heavy combo using Light a Secca and just want to get through. Yeah, also another thing is that another thing that you'll see between casuals and competitives is that casuals almost never have a side deck. I have seen some casual players, usually, one thing I did notice though is like whenever you introduce a competitive player to a group of casuals, is that usually they will start to develop a side deck. So that's kind of an interesting thing. Like, I know I sound like a nature documentary talking like that, but it's true. Like whenever I became more competitive and I joined a few of my casual friends when I took a back seat, I still had my side deck put together, and so I noticed that a lot of my friends who played in this small little casual group started putting cards together for a small side deck. Granted, it was only 6 to 10 cards at the time, but still, that's something. So yeah, that's another big difference, is that usually casuals don't have a side deck put together. So but for the most part, the decks are generally built the same, using 3 ofs and 2 ofs and 1 ofs and stuff like that. They generally know how the deck plays and how it's built and how you should play it, because casuals, just like competitive players, they do want to win. They just might not enjoy going to big tournaments, or just like prefer just to sit down with friends every now and then and play a game. So it's definitely, or they might not like that they can't play a certain deck competitively anymore, so they just kind of take a back seat and play casually. So that's another big thing about competitive and casuals, is that difference. Moving into bad players, and this is the one I kind of want to talk about. So something I noticed with a very specific bad player is that they decided to build their decks with one-ofs exclusively and call that a casual deck. And I still think that there's a big issue with bad players, kind of like generally bad players calling themselves casual and ruining the name of real casuals. Because when you like, I've definitely played against real casuals. They have them down at the locals, down at Dragon's Keep where I play, and they're usually pretty okay sports about going up against competitive decks, especially casuals who have been to that locals before. They're definitely usually like they go in there knowing, oh well, I might take 1 or 2 games, and but for the most, like, you know, it's just like that mindset. But when a bad player goes in, they get frustrated when they lose. I'm going back into the mindset of a bad player, but they get frustrated when they lose to a competitive deck because they're like, oh, you just paid this much to win. They also like might play really subpar cards in their deck, something along the lines of Magic Cylinder. Usually, one thing I've noticed with some players, with some bad players who've come in there, is that I remember one time a dude was playing 2 copies of each piece of Exodia in his deck, and so that was an issue that we had to address. There's also been times when I've seen bad players just utterly like they'll just utterly playing the entire deck, just like, oh, it's a Geargia deck, but then they have like super heavy samurai pendulum monsters and like all these weird cards that are like don't go with the theme or don't help synergize at all. Bad players also go along with the mindset of that 60, like this is another thing that I've noticed with some bad players, that they think 60 cards is like the best way to play because they can fit every strategy they get. And usually a bad player will have the whole, well, if I put in 1 Dark Magic Curtain and 1 Dark Magician, then I can summon that Dark Magician more. And then it's like, but if I don't get that, I'll put in 1 Blue Eyes White Dragon, so that way I'll have that to fall back on. They have this weird, like, stepping stone mentality of when they build a deck that this is going to come up every time with their 60 one-ofs. It's very stark in contrast to how a real casual would build a deck. Another thing is that I've noticed about bad players, that bad players, like, they won't put links in their extra deck. So, like, something along the lines of, like, Nightmare Cerberus. Nightmare Cerberus is a super rare, and you get one of those, and you get a super rare in every pack now. So to say, oh, I don't use links because they're all bad or because I don't like them, and so you don't reserve any spots in your extra deck for them, is kind of like just not playing to the strengths that your deck could possibly do. Especially since there are some decks, especially ABCs now, that love links, like, and spirals. They even got a link monster. So while casual players definitely at least put in like a Decode Talker and an Underclock Taker into their extra decks to play the links. That's a big difference in between the two things. So another thing about bad players is that whenever they build their decks and they show up and you're looking at their deck and you're like, man, this deck looks like it's from like 2010. And they're like, yeah, well, I just didn't like the new rules or any of the new decks, and I don't really like to keep up with the format. So they'll have this like deck that's like completely outdated, and they'll just be complaining about like all the new stuff. Like, I remember, I think it was something recently, and I dropped Purple Nightfall turn 1, and they were like, how'd you summon that? And I was like, because there's 2 cards in the column. And he didn't have a playmat, and he was like, well, they're not in the same column. I'm like, but looking at my mat and looking across from you, they are in the same spot. That's another thing about bad players. Most of them don't have mats. A lot of them don't have mats. But yeah, there's just a lot of bad players, and bad players definitely, whenever they come off, like whenever they try to defend themselves, they definitely come off more as elitists, saying, oh, well, my deck is more unique, that makes it better, because I filled my deck with 50 one-ofs compared to your superior Trickstar Sky Striker deck that plays 3 Candina. Because you play those 3 Candinas, you're the elitist. And it's like, it's a really toxic situation right there with the bad players, and it's really unfortunate because a lot of the times what you'll see is a new player come in and they like picked up like a starter deck, or they picked up like 5 packs, and they don't really know what they're doing. They get like, they're like, oh well, I like this card and I like this card, so maybe I'll play this, or you know, and they'll have like a starter deck with a few different cards in there. And a lot of the time they will, like, if a competitive player talks to them, because like, especially if you one of the things I've noticed is that whenever a real casual player comes in and sits down and plays against one of the competitive players, after the game, the competitive player will ask them questions about the deck, and usually the casual player listens and takes the advice. And it's like, oh well, you're playing some of the Lair of Darkness cards. You only got 1. Go pick up another 1 or 2, because that deck is actually kind of okay in a casual setting and can probably steal wins because of the way that it plays. But a bad player will take that advice. They'll like, so say it's like, oh, you're playing some of the Lair of Darkness cards, you should probably get more of those Lair of Darkness cards. The bad player will go, no, I prefer having the one-ofs because it makes my deck more unique and makes the game more fun. I don't see how losing every game is fun, personally. But yes, that's just my thoughts on the different deck building and things that you'll notice when talking to and communicating with bad players, casual players, and competitive players. I definitely think that there was a bit of camaraderie at regionals. At least the one I went to, I never had a bad experience with any people that I played against at the Tulsa Regional. It was actually pretty rad. There was one bad moment, but you guys can watch that in the Tulsa vlog, which might be up here, because that was actually a pretty funny story of a toxic player. But yeah, for the most part, I know that casuals are usually pretty good at debating with each other. I know that competitive players are usually pretty good at debating with each other, and I know that bad players are kind of like this like weird shadow cult that prefers to play one-ofs and just... Anyway, thank you guys for watching. Tell me what your experiences with bad players, if you have any experience with bad players, in the comments below and what they are, and I'll see you guys in the next video.